Welcome to this meeting of the Select Committee on Science and Technology. We have two witnesses we're very pleased to welcome, Professor Angela Gallop, a forensic scientist and a member of the Westminster Commission on Forensic Science, and Professor Carole McCartney, also a forensic scientist and also a member of the Westminster Commission on Forensic Science.
I'm not a forensic scientist.
I'm sorry?
I'm not a forensic scientist. I'm an academic lawyer who researches forensic science.
I'm so sorry. Okay, we misrepresented you as being a forensic scientist. Okay, thank you for correcting us on that. We hope we are also going to have Professor Niamh Daeid coming in online, but at the moment she's having a connection problem. I also want to explain to everybody that at 11 o'clock exactly we will pause the broadcast for a 2-minute silence and then we will resume the broadcast. So let me start with you both, Professor Gallop, Professor McCartney. You were both commissioners on the Westminster Commission on Forensic Science, and you were involved in its report that was published earlier this year. So by way of introduction, perhaps you could set out for us the background as to why the Commission was set up and what some of its most important findings and recommendations were. And we would like to know, in your view, what is the current state of forensic science in the UK. And perhaps you could set out how the issues identified around forensic science back in 2018, when we did an inquiry, this committee did an inquiry, what you think has changed since that time. And we would also like you to talk about what you think is the likelihood of further miscarriages of justice if these various issues are not addressed. So let's start. Professor Gallop, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. And good morning, everybody. I think since 2005, there have been 7 major reports into forensic science, and including particularly the most recent one, the one that your committee produced. And they were talking of multiple significant, deep-rooted and persistent issues. And I think in forensic science, we very much identified with that. We believe that forensic science isn't working for anybody. It's not working for the police, it's not working for forensic scientists, it's not working for lawyers, and ultimately it's not working for the general public when they read about miscarriages in the press. Anyway, since 2017, the Home Office has intervened in at least 6 major market and quality failures, and it's been terrible watching 3 of the 4 main suppliers of forensic science have awful problems. Some of them disappear. It started with the Forensic Science Service in 2012, but then Key Forensics and most recently Cellmark have all, well, Key is still managing, but in a completely altered form, and Cellmark has gone. You produced an extremely good report in 2019, and I mean, I said that at the time. We all forensic scientists thought that, but most of the recommendations haven't been acted upon, much to our dismay. There were broken promises of a Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, and that's why the APPG on miscarriages of justice decided to commission their own reports, and that's why we ended up looking at forensic science in the way that we did. The report that the APPG did on the CCRC, in there was often reference made to the potential contribution of forensic science to miscarriages of justice. And of course there were miscarriages of justice coming through in the press during that time. There was Andy Malkinson, Peter Sullivan most recently, after 38 years in prison, was finally exonerated on DNA evidence. And we believe that more miscarriages of justice are absolutely inevitable. We were spending a lot of time looking at near misses which are cases that were rescued on the brink of going through our court process by a forensic scientist employed by the defence. And that's happening less and less frequently, so you can just imagine these near misses the number will go down, but the number of miscarriages will go up. And so we wrote our report. We looked at 3 particular areas. We looked at, and they were different chapters in our report. We looked at, first of all, the delivery of forensic science services and the market and the problems with that. And then we looked at the criminal process, the way forensic science is used, both by the police but particularly by lawyers and the courts. And then finally, we looked at the science and the scientists on which forensic science relies. And so those were the 3 main areas, and everything we wanted to say seemed to come out of, everything we discovered seemed to come out of one or other of those 3 areas. And sometimes, obviously, there were overlaps. So we talked about the worsening problems in each of the areas, and we've made a series of recommendations in relation to them. But we were very keen in the report, well aware of funding constraints and all that sort of thing, very keen to imagine a system which isn't too radically different from what we've got now, so people might think that it would be achievable. And so we were very keen to do that in our recommendations. I think one of the key things we were really keen about was to ensure that forensic science is and remains independent. So not for the prosecution, not for the defence, but in the middle. We wanted to make sure that the protection and science of science and scientists was firm and enduring, and so we talked about a National Forensic Science Institute, which I think is something that appeared in the House of Lords report in 2019, but we absolutely think that that's pretty critical. And through that, and Carole can talk more eloquently than I can about this, but creating a series of academic centres of excellence. This has certainly worked in other areas. In fact, I think there's a new police structure that's rather similar. We want to strengthen the sector because we believe, again, as I think you did in your earlier report, but that the market provides a really good basis for forensic science, and we can explain about that. And so we need to make sure that that's strengthened and it's safe, and attract new entrants. I mean, because it's been so damaged by these awful market failures that, something needs to happen to make that more secure and enrich it a bit. And ensure that we have enough experts, because the awful thing, and particularly at the complicated end of forensic science, is that we're losing so much of our expertise. And it's absolutely terrifying. And for someone like me who's, specialised in, well, several things, but one of them is the investigation of really complex and often historical cases. And we just have, you could count them on the fingers of less fingers than on one hand. And it is terrifying to watch that expertise just drifting away and nobody really noticing, nobody really caring about it, apparently. So, at the moment, we're in a position where we used to be world leading, but we're certainly not now. In fact, now the issue is, are we going to survive? Which is why we gave the title of our report such a dramatic thing, pulling out of the graveyard spiral. Because that was, when we had finished, that's what all the commissioners felt about it. We were trying to decide on a title and we all agreed that is actually what we're saying. We've had unrelenting critical scrutiny for years. Going back to the late 80s, actually, in forensic science. We've been constantly writing reports and things and submissions for inquiries of one sort or another. We've had continual upgrades to regulatory requirements, and we're very pleased that we have a forensic regulator and all of that, but it's not the answer to everything, and certainly it doesn't address some of the core issues facing forensic science at the moment. So unremitting change, lots of deck chairs being moved about. We've had an enormous amount of that. And we've been concerned about the apparent complacency of the Home Office in all of this. When we spoke to them, they didn't seem to be aware or concerned, maybe just not concerned about what was going on. I thought we were making a fuss about nothing. And so the benefits of the market, the market when it was set up, when it was emerging, through the 2000s, I now look back on that period and think this was the best time for forensic science, because the competition in the market, which wasn't too severe at that time, the market was still fairly new, but competition was causing different suppliers to be imaginative and more determined, and it was always we're collaborative, absolutely, but we're also just seeing if we can't do it slightly better, and that was incredibly healthy. It got the cost of services down, it speeded them up dramatically, got rid of backlogs, and it meant that innovation, new innovation was brought into forensic science, which actually solved a raft of difficult old cases. Damilola Taylor, Rachel Nickel, Stephen Lawrence, Coastal Path murders. The list is long, but they were all helped to be solved by private companies and not by the Forensic Science Service. I always think there's a bit of a misunderstanding about that, but it's true. So, faster, cheaper, better was all things that we hoped would come to pass and had come to pass. And during that decade, I and my colleagues, were saying, well, it's amazing actually, but if you really apply your mind to forensic science, there's almost nothing that you can't do, because our success rate was so impressive. And so I've always thought since then, it's nothing to do with the market, it's how it's governed and how it's funded. Those are the issues. I've probably talked enough.
That's excellent. Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have many more questions. Professor McCartney, before I come to you, I just want to welcome Professor Nick Daeid, who's come online. I hope you can hear us, Professor Nick Daeid.
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you so much. Professor Nick Daeid is a forensic scientist, and she's director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science. We'll come to you shortly, Professor Nick Daeid. I started this session by asking Professor McCartney and Professor Gallop just to sort of recap where they thought we are in the field of forensic science, and specifically both of them having been commissioners of the Westminster Commission. So I'll ask Professor McCartney to introduce herself and say something about those points, and then we'll come to you as well. So, Professor McCartney.
Well, Professor Gallop has covered really quite comprehensively why we did the report and what we found during the report. I think importantly, because you had done such a comprehensive and good report in 2019, we tried to take that as a stepping off point, so look at what has happened since 2019, but obviously then have to put a lot of that in context of what had gone on previously. And I think what we were trying to achieve was looking at the whole system, that it's not just about science in a laboratory, we've got your crime scene, courtroom, underlying science, so we tried to cover the breadth of it. And as Angela said, we found worsening conditions in all three of the areas that we chose to focus on. So the delivery of forensic science, forensic evidence in courtrooms and how it's being used by the criminal justice system, and then the actual underpinning science and conditions for forensic scientists themselves. And what we'd found really since 2019, even just in that fairly short period, was obviously massive market constriction. So we're now left in a position, as Angela said, where we really have a monopoly. There's not really a competitive market. So that comes on top of already the problems you have when there's only one customer, really, the police. But we really now only have one supplier also, and all the risks that are attendant with having a monopoly supplier in any organisation, any sector. But we found really a very dramatic loss of capacity of forensic science and loss of capabilities, and both of those things very alarming. And of course what it has led to is growing in-house provision, so police taking on a lot more responsibilities and a lot more provision of their own kind of forensic sciencing, but also a real narrowing of, like I say, our capacity and capabilities. And we found that beyond kind of fairly standard DNA testing, toxicology analysis, things that the police kind of have a statutory duty to do, then things like complicated casework, trace analysis, fibres, all of those other things have just fallen off the radar entirely. They're very, very peripheral now. So we've got a real fragmentation as well around the country of what actual forensic services you can get depending on the police force and who they've contracted with and what they've contracted for. The Home Office, like Angela said, found some perhaps alarming complacency there. They did have a forensic reform programme which had 4 ultimate goals, and I know that when we went and they presented it to us, essentially they achieved one of them and then the programme ended. So they got a statutory basis for the forensic science regulator, but they didn't manage to achieve their other goals. And one of the big things we saw is that a lot has been done to streamline forensic science. So we even have streamlined forensic reporting, but the focus has always been on efficiencies. We've got to do fast, quick, be efficient, and everything has come down to money. And that means that we've kind of shed a lot of the safeguards and the checks and balances and the things that made you sit back and say, let's think about this, let's do a proper forensic strategy, let's collaborate with the police and the scientists, all those things that are seen as inefficient because they're slow, they're expensive, but they get quality results. They've all really been shorn away, so we're left now with a kind of skeleton provision of forensic science now that's really focused on speed and efficiency and easy testing, and that's the thing we are most scared about, leading really to miscarriages of justice.
Thank you very much. Professor Nick Daeid, we remember you, I and 3 other members of this committee remember you from our 2018 inquiry, so we're very pleased to have you as a witness to this session, which is essentially trying to follow up on that inquiry. Broadly speaking, can you set out how you think things have changed since 2018, the time of our last inquiry, and can you also comment on the likelihood of miscarriages of justice that the Westminster Commission certainly identified?
Yes, and firstly, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to provide information to the committee. It's a great honour, again, to be in front of you. I come to this from a slightly different frame because across my 30 plus years working in forensic science, I've been predominantly an academic, but I've also undertaken, obviously, research funded by a whole raft of different research organisations and agencies, including the Home Office and charitable trusts, etc. But I also, of course, do casework, and so know this from the front end of the business as well as the back end, one might say. I think the questions, first of all, are very interesting because we have to remember that within, of course, the UK, we have the devolved nations and the way in which they do forensic science and the way in which they resource forensic science provision is very different from England and Wales. And so often there's a frame put around UK forensic science that might not be necessarily completely correct. And of course, the House of Lords discussions back in 2018, 2019 were also framed around England and Wales. But what I would say is that there is another model against which, within the United Kingdom, against which we can relate and we can frame things. I think in terms of when I give evidence to yourselves and also indeed to the Westminster Commission, what has changed? I can only see a change for the worst, I'm afraid. I think that there's been a continued erosion in England and Wales of the independence of science, that the scientific services provided to the criminal justice system are very much dictated by monetary value, which has its own knock-on effects in terms of how that scientific evidence is generated and how it is presented. I think it causes a real challenge with this being driven predominantly through a prosecutorial frame. It causes a real challenge for the defence and for the defence expertise to be able to explore that evidence, that scientific evidence in its fullest sense. That said, what's changed in the outside world around us has been really significant. During this time frame, myself and some colleagues overseas in Australia and the United States and in Europe produced a position piece called the Sydney Declaration, where we tried to reframe forensic science against a definition that was quite broad-based rather than simply science in the service of law, as many people would see it, but also tried to lay out a set of principles against which we could develop coherence around forensic science provision driven by scientists for the justice system. So there are other things going on outside of the United Kingdom and indeed outside of England and Wales that are causing some quite significant changes in the profession and in the way in which science and law interacts, not least the work we do up in my own centre. So there is change happening around us. Whether England and Wales is benefiting from it, I doubt at the moment, I'm afraid. Does this lead to a greater opportunity or possibility for miscarriages of justice within England and Wales? I'm afraid I think that the answer to that is yes, because we're not getting the scrutiny of the level of science that is required in order to have equality of arms across the system. And I think, as both Carole and Angela have already said, there is a push to get the cheapest test done. That may not be the right test to do. There isn't really a dialogue between the scientists and law enforcement to try to decide what might be the right test for a particular framework of circumstances. And the dialogue between the scientists and the legal profession, I think, is probably even more strained. And so we are currently not in a particularly good place.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that, for those opening remarks. We have quite a lot of questions for all three of you, and which we're looking forward to hearing your responses. Lord Borwick.
Thank you. My question is number two, and I think you pretty comprehensively answered it already, but could you lay out how these changes that have happened in the last 10 years have actually affected the forensic science provision over the last decade? And in particular, how is the market... You alluded to certain of the companies going bust and others giving up. Why was that? Were they not paid enough, or and what is the effect of one organisation having 85% of the market?
That's a Gallop. Would you like to start?
Yes. Could I just say one thing first, though, that came out of listening to what Niamh was saying? I think there's a big misunderstanding about forensic science, and I think this is at the heart of quite a lot of what we're seeing. People seem to think, or police seem to think, that it's all about tests, just tests. You string together a few tests and Bob's your uncle. You've got the result and you've got evidence. But actually it's about so much more than that. It's about which tests you do on what items and when you do them. It's about that whole investigative strategy and how you build on that. It's about understanding the crime scene, which is where all our forensic evidence, or most of it, comes from. So there's a huge front end to it. Then there are the tests, which are terribly important, but they're just in the middle. And then there's the whole back end, which is working out what on earth they mean in the circumstances of the particular case that you're investigating. And that could be quite complex, and it may require you to do a little bit more research into sort of, the likelihood of this and the likelihood of that. How common is something? How rare is it? In order to get that right. So you have to do all of that and then present it in a manner that everybody understands without losing accuracy. There's a lot of different moving parts to a forensic investigation, and it's not just about tests.
Thank you. Now, Lord Borrett's question about the companies going bust.
Yes. Let me just see what about this. As I say, the market has undergone huge change. In the 2000s, I thought that it was working really well. That's the sort of point at which it was big enough and developed enough. But since then, the police have been under increasing pressure with their budgets, and I think forensic science stands out, although it's only a tiny proportion of their budget, and absolutely tiny these days. But it stands out because it's a fairly large proportion of their external spend, and so it's easy to look at it and think, oh, well, we'll slice a bit off that, and that'll give us a bit more for, other police requirements. And so that meant that the police became much more concerned about what they commissioned, and they also started doing much more of it themselves, which of course gives you other problems. We have a regulator, and he sets time scales for when accreditation should be achieved. But if the police say to him, well, I'm afraid we can't do that, and if you're not going to let us do the tests if we don't have this accreditation, then I'm afraid the system will fall apart and we won't be able to do our job. And so the timetables get put back and put back. So it does actually impinge on the regulator. The contracting process for forensic science organisations has been absolutely horrendous, from bunching of massive contracts all together, fairly short timescales, competition, price competition, going through the floor, so suppliers are so keen to get as much work as they can to fill their laboratories and keep their scientists busy, that they've been quoting prices which often barely make a profit, if make a profit at all. Sometimes cost them money, actually, and that was one of the problems that Cellmark had. Scene attendance is not what it was. There's now a lot of regulation attached to that, and scene of crime officers complain to us that now, while they used to do 6 or 7 scenes a day, now they can only do 1 or 2 because they've got all these bits and pieces to put in place before they can do anything meaningful. Police investigations are relying on, as Carole said, quick and easy tests and just tests, and don't really think much beyond that. And they don't really work in complex investigations. When, for example, sometimes you have to look for something to find something else. And the Coastal Path murders and the Stephen Lawrence murder are perfect examples of that, where we didn't find the body fluid evidence that gave us the big statistics and the strength of evidence by looking directly for blood. We missed it, as the previous scientists before us had missed it. But we found it eventually by looking for textile fibres, and that's what led us to the blood. So, it has to be much more imaginative than people imagine, forensic science, or it doesn't give you what it's got, because it's got a huge amount to offer. The triaging of forensic submissions was another big problem that's affected everything. The lack of expertise. The police do most of the triaging. And I think the fact that they're not forensic scientists means that sometimes they don't realise what sorts of things could be done or what sorts of things you need to do. And also they don't do it in the kind of way that scientists have learnt to do it, using this sort of more scientific method of saying, now let's try and focus on what we need to be looking at. Let's see what the prosecution and the defence are saying, these two competing propositions, and let's see what lies in the middle and what's going to give the answer. And that is a brilliant way of focusing, and from an independent point of view, focusing the kind of work that you do, the sort of examinations and the sort of tests. But that doesn't happen. Triaging is really, at the moment, done with, well, this is what the police think, what do we need to be able to prove it, what should we look for? Which takes me right back to when I started in forensic science in 1974. That's the sort of thing that was going on then. I thought we'd left it all behind, but anyway. Investment and interest seems to have been diverted to digital forensic. If it's digital, then it can have whatever it wants. Whether or not it's successful or not is another matter. But that's created a great problem for traditional forensic science, which will always be important. And regulation has been so costly for smaller firms. It's even for the smallest firm, it would be tens of thousands a year to maintain that, to get it to maintain it. And for defence experts, who very often work on their own or in very small groups, that was just too expensive for them to afford. They wouldn't make the money on the casework they did to make that make sense. So a lot of them have left the market. So those are the kinds of problems that have led to the situation we find ourselves in today.
Thank you. Professor McCartney, you've got anything to add?
Yeah, I think one thing we do talk about a lot is obviously police expenditure, and you can't blame them for the fact that they've had to try and find savings because they've had their budgets cut. One of the difficulties is there's often a false economy with them thinking, well, we don't want to send money outside to forensic scientists. What can we not do? What can we save money on? What could we just do ourselves then that would be cheaper? And so you find a lot of this triaging, so things won't get done or they'll wait and see, and can we solve this case some other way first, more cheaply, more in-house and so forth. But that has an effect on crime scene examination. So we've spoken to crime scene examiners who say, well, there's not a lot of point in me getting samples because I know they won't be tested, because when I take them back to the force is never going to pay to get all of this tested, so then there's no point me collecting it. And that is going to have dramatic effects in years to come, where we have not collected the evidence. So you can see miscarriages of justice occurring, but also an inability to solve or remedy those miscarriages of justice, because there won't be the trove of evidence in the warehouse sitting there that we can then get out and do the work that Angela and others and Niamh have done for years of solving cold cases and overturning miscarriages of justice. So there's a real risk there with the police taking things in-house, but the effect that the drive on saving money is having.
If the police do it, and do it properly with scientific training, it's not necessarily bad, is it? I mean, if that's the way it used to be done. In the very old days, was done by policemen, wasn't it?
Then there's a very good reason we stopped doing that.
And that's the reason we stopped. Now you say it's coming back into being done by the police themselves.
Yes.
Is that necessarily bad, or just in practice bad?
Police are not scientists. And there should be real independence, and there has to be impartiality, and the science should be done by scientists. I think everyone else around the world has recognised that you cannot turn police officers, and nor should you, into forensic scientists. They're two different professions, and it's too risky in terms of impartiality and independence to... Yeah.
Sorry, could I just say that because it's so easy to deflect an investigation, it depends what you find, depends on very much what you look for. And if you're coming with a set, I wouldn't want to say mindset particularly, but you're coming from a particular organisation, and you think someone's done something and you want to just see whether they have or not, spending as little money as possible, then your selection of which items you look for and what tests you're going to do on them can skew the results you get, and can skew what you make of the results. And so that's why it's so important, first of all, to do that scientifically, as a scientist would, by looking at competing propositions to get your path for examination and testing. But then to make sure you know what it means at the end of the day.
Professor Neuberger wants to come in, and then we'll come to you, Professor Nick Daeid.
Okay, so I'm absolutely take the point about independence, but there are civilian scientists within the police, aren't there? So how does that work? And are you essentially saying that if you have civilian scientists within the police, they will not have the independence that an independent forensic service would have? Because I think that's quite important.
I don't think so, because they're sitting within an organisation which has something. And the other thing is that they're not sitting within an organisation which whose main responsibility, main job is to do science. And that's really important, because scientists don't operate in a vacuum. They need to interact with other scientists, and particularly in an investigation, you never know what you're going to come up against. I mean, a forensic trace can involve absolutely anything, any kind of physical trace. So you're bound to have to get in touch with all sorts of experts about strange things, fish scales and bone china. It can be absolutely anything. And so it's a collaborative process, and it's very much a sort of scientific investigation.
So even if you are not an official police person, you're a civilian scientist within the police, you're saying you still...
I don't
you will be attracted, pulled in some way into what the rest of the police are doing.
Well, in some way, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And even if it's only because of the budget,
No,
and trying to be careful about that, and so it's just the realities of life, really, I think. I think the only way forward is to have it completely independent. And I remember when I joined the Home Office in 1974, one of the things we were really pleased about was the fact that we worked for the Home Office and not the police. And so when we got to court, lawyers couldn't say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, because you work for the police. Yeah. And we could say, no, we don't, actually. We're quite separate. And we used to feel rather sorry for the Metropolitan Police forensic scientists who had to face that sort of thing much more often than we did.
Lord Lucas, you want to come in, and then we will come to Professor Nick Daeid.
Professor McCartney, you said something about the scene of crime officers being burdened by additional regulation. Is that something you can give us some pointers for? If not now, afterwards in a letter, just so that we can understand that. And, and secondly, on that subject, should these people be part of the forensic service, part of the police service? Is their training, should that be part of your responsibility? How does that relationship work? In your ideal system, not now.
I think Niamh can probably explain as well that in Scotland it is done differently, so the crime scene examiners aren't working for the police. One of the difficulties with our report was we were trying to find a way of not just coming up with our ideal forensic model that was just so fantastical that everyone would just put it on the shelf and say, well, they're dreaming, that's never going to happen. If you asked us what our dream would be, yes, crime scene examiners wouldn't work for the police. They would not be civilian officers, because that is an important part of the forensic process. And the fact that they work within police forces and for police forces and pay for them is, I think, problematic in terms of their independence, their impartiality. And it isn't any slur on anybody to say that you're not impartial or whatever. It's the nature of human beings. There's a lot of psychological research about cognitive bias, and it's unconscious, and we're not talking about a police officer tapping you on the shoulder saying, please can you change that test result. We're talking about the culture and the environment in which you work, and if that culture and environment is a policed prosecutorial environment, then that's not the way that scientists work. And so any human, and there are not superhuman scientists that are not influenced by the working conditions. Every human is.
Professor Nick Daeid, you've been very patient.
Not at all. Thank you. And to go back to Lord Borwick's question, one of the things that will and has been indeed impacted quite dramatically is the ability for the forensic science providers to undertake research. Because in normal circumstances, or at least back in the old days, a research component was part of the activities that forensic science providers would become engaged with. research is the lifeblood of science. Science doesn't stay still, and should not certainly stay still. And as forensic scientists become more attuned to particular trends or experience more complicated, let's say, challenges that are placed in front of them because of their experience working within the justice framework, then research and development becomes an obvious thing.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're going to have just a 2-minute pause in. Professor Daeid, please resume where you were just before we pause then.
Thank you. So research suffers. Research in the hands of private organizations and companies becomes very much driven by their needs rather than driven by the needs of the science. And so I think that's a point I wanted to make. I think another element of the question was, can some tests be, or are there other countries that have different approaches? There are some countries around the world, notably in Australia, but also in Europe, that bring together forensic science provision with public health provision. And that might streamline, for example, tests in toxicology in particular, but also other countries bring environmental investigation together with forensic science investigation, which allows you to bring together a different means whereby both equipment, resources, personnel, and indeed research can be co-shared and co-owned. So there are different models for doing this. All of them have their challenges, but there are different ways of having a more sort of commercially driven activity, particularly, as I said, around forensic toxicology and potentially around DNA. Carole mentioned a touch up to what is going on here in Scotland. In 2013, the Scottish police forces, I believe there were 8 of them, reconfigured into one police force called Police Scotland. That happened in 2013. It was not without pain. And all of those who remember those days will know that it was a painful process. But nonetheless, it did provide a framework by which a number of things could be moved forward. And over the years, 2 of the main areas of forensic science work, or work that was done actually related to forensic science that was done by the police, are now done by the forensic scientists, and that's fingerprints and crime scene investigation. So both of those elements and aspects of work up in Scotland are done by forensic scientists under the auspices of the Scottish Police Authority Forensic Services. And what that brings And what it has brought, again, over time and with shifting culture, people, processes, etc., what it has brought is a scientific focus into those disciplines. And we would definitely advocate that the scientific element of an investigation of any incident begins at the crime scene. It doesn't begin in the laboratory with a test. It begins at the crime scene with people thinking about what items should I recover from this space or these individuals that will give maximum opportunity for science to help answer the alleged activity that has been understood to have taken place. And that mindset change, it sounds trivial and it sounds easy, but it is not. And it requires quite a significant cultural shift, a shift in focus around where do we bring science into the process? What does science actually mean in terms of what can it deliver to the process? That we're not technology driven, because we might not need technology. We might just need the right way of thinking like scientists. And it brings automatically an independence into the way in which crime scenes are investigated and how samples are chosen, recovered, and then brought to the laboratory. It's not perfect, but I think the step change in difference of how the particular individuals involved in the process now think is quite noteworthy.
Thank you. Baroness Noel-Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. I think all three of you have painted a picture of sort of gradual degradation of market provision, of something which started out reasonably, but is no longer working. And indeed, it seems to me you're talking about something where systemic failure is now, really a part of the scene, and not being arrested. So the question I wanted to ask you is really about the attitude of government. I think it was Professor Gallop who said the Home Office doesn't seem to care. There's also the Justice Department these days, not previously part of the scene. What do you observe about that department's interest in this subject, given that it is presumably of interest to them whether we actually get justice in our courts? And where do you think, in future, governmental responsibility ought to lie? Do we have the right people, the right department in government, and the right priorities coming from both from the Office of Government, the implementer, and indeed the legislation? So that's the first part of it. And so, against your judgments on that, where do you think we ought to start trying to rectify it? And President Daeid said, I think, that at one point she said there are choices. She said there's more than one way in which you can do this. And so do you believe that also? Do all three of you believe that to be the case? In which case, what are the choices, and do they have systemic consequences that you go down different paths potentially?
I kick off with when we said about a Home Office, they're not particularly transparent, so that can obviously lead to belief in their complacency because they don't actually tell you what they're doing. We know now that there are lots of plans for massive policing reform, and forensic science is a little part of that. The difficulty being, I think, that the Home Office are leading it because they lead the police, and of course then we have our problem of, well, forensic science really shouldn't be steered by just the police, but forensic science is now getting caught up with, well, what can we do about this disastrous situation? Well, you're going to have to wait until we've reformed the police, but we're a bit concerned we haven't got that long to wait before.
Have they consulted at all? This is probably a silly question, but have they attempted to consult on
They've told their plans to people, but then we're waiting for a white paper. Vet Cooper was supposed to be bringing a white paper on police reform. The details, I think, are still being hashed out. There's a new director of forensic science services although she doesn't have any forensic science services to direct. And so she's been employed for 2 years, and presumably you'll speak to her about her plans of, she's supposed to be writing a blueprint for what's going to happen with forensic science as part of this Home Office reshaping of policing in general. So there's the problem with the Home Office. The Ministry of Justice, to be perfectly honest, was even worse, though, because we kept approaching them for a meeting and they were literally telling us there's nobody here to talk to. There had been one member of staff who'd been involved in forensic science, but he'd left a year previously and nobody replaced him. So when we were saying, well, we're doing this commission, can we talk to somebody? They were saying, no, there's nobody to talk to, because you need to talk to the Legal Aid Agency or the CPS or the Criminal Bar Association. They're not us. We eventually had a meeting with some young ladies who were in a miscarriages of justice unit, but then they'd only been there a couple of months and all they were working on was the post office. So they were saying, well, forensic science isn't part of the post office, so we don't know anything about it. So we literally got nowhere with the Ministry of Justice. And I think this is the big problem here, is that, like your report, but also our report, whose desk is it landing on, and whose responsibility is it? Well, it's nobody's. We don't have a minister that has forensic science in their remit, so there's nowhere for the buck to stop. And then, of course, I'm not an expert in politics, you guys are, but if there's no minister, then that's not feeding down to other departments saying, oh, we ought to do something about this because our minister needs us to do something about it. So if we were making recommendations, the buck has to stop somewhere, and where that sits between the Home Office or the Ministry of Justice and even DSIT, because we're talking about science here and science funding and science research, then it's got to fall somewhere. At the moment, it just falls through the gaps between them. And so we're not getting traction. Forensic science is just caught up with the Home Office, but we don't think they should be piloting this alone.
Professor Gallop, do you want to add anything?
I was just very interested to hear what Niamh was saying about different models, because of course that's absolutely right. I mean, we're used to having either a national service or a market, and there are sort of collaborations that actually could make that look slightly different. When we went to see the Scottish laboratory, we were really impressed with some things, and particularly the fact that they had managed, and it must have been really difficult, but to get fingerprints and scenes of crime into the same basket as forensics, because they are absolutely at the beginning of the forensic process, and you have to understand the crime scene and you have to collect the right stuff in order to get anything out of forensic science laboratory. So it's really, really important that. So that was fascinating. I think that like the forensic science service we had here, there are advantages of plurality in forensic science, as I talked about earlier. And I wonder, as time goes by, whether some of the problems that affected the forensic science service might also just creep into the Scottish model. Having said that, they obviously have some really talented managers there, and some good scientists too. So there's no, I'm not basing it on anything. I'm just speculating that, of what happened to the forensic science service with my long association with it. And then there's another very interesting thought. We also went to see the the Netherlands Forensic Institute, because they have a very good reputation for forensic science, a bit like the forensic science service used to have in the old days. And so we went to see them. And I just wonder whether in the UK we are just, as we often are, ahead of the curve and therefore facing all the challenges and not being able to learn quite as much from other people who've been through exactly the same thing as we have. But the Netherlands Institute is now getting extremely worried about private providers who are coming in with new ideas, with different technology, able to do things quicker and probably slightly more cost effectively. And so they're getting very concerned about that, and that reminds me of nothing so much as what happened in the early days of the development of the market in the 90s. So I just wonder, it'd be very interesting to watch them, and they were very keen to learn from the experiences we'd had.
Are these techniques that the private sector bringing in the Netherlands, are they better or different or
just different? And it's
and do they represent where things ought to go, or are they contrary?
I think they're just ideas that are worth trying out, you know. And I think it's just that, well, can we do it this way? Well, let's have a look. Oh, that really works. Great, we'll do that. Or actually, it's not quite so good as the old way, so let's not. So
that's not happening here.
No, well, not really. Now, 86% of the market is with one particular provider, and so. And I think that, even though you can have different laboratories in the same organisation, they all, of course, behave in very much the same way. And so, but if you've got two different organisations, then they are thinking differently. And I know that was a huge deal in the early 2000s, the fact that you had that diversity and plurality of thought. Because it was very interesting in the market, each different provider had a different professional personality, and I had never really thought about that till it became perfectly obvious. And some of them were very good at some things, and some of them were better at others. But it was.
And again, I don't think that's to blame the forensic providers. I mean, the forensic providers that we went around. I mean, some of the laboratories that they've invested in, state-of-the-art laboratories, and they're doing an amazing job. But they're a business who are trying to work on margins that are impossible to work with. To survive as a business, you have to be able to make some kind of profit, and they're not, because they're being starved, because their customer won't pay for quality, won't pay for doing research, won't pay for, they'll only pay for the barest minimum. And they used to balance things by, well, if we do all these DNA tests, then we can use some of that money to put it over here. But then when that's starved of funds as well, then the forensic providers, they're working on a shoestring, and they're doing an incredible job, but it's unsustainable. And that's what we're seeing, and that's why it's called a graveyard spiral, because we believe this is unsustainable.
A lot of this has to do with money. It's budget.
Lack of investment, that we're not investing properly in something that is actually quite important and hugely beneficial. If you actually evaluated the benefits of forensic science, you'd probably find there's huge savings to be made with, crime detection, preventing miscarriages of justice, all of these things. But it's just seen as a cost.
Is that the most urgent thing for government, is money?
Well, I think it might be possible to divert money from other kinds of activities that it's been going to. For example, some of the deck chair moving that we've had.
We have a lot more questions. I'm sorry to move us along. Lord Berkeley, I think Professor Gallop has already talked about the Netherlands. Do you want to ask your question?
Could I just make a very quick sort of supplementary? Because you've given us a fairly depressing view on transparency, the role of the police, and funding. And you've quoted few examples from other countries, but is there anything more that can be done to learn from other countries and the way they do it, both in terms of independence and funding? Because it seems to me that that's the most important thing which we don't have, and we've mentioned Scotland and I think Netherlands, but is there anywhere else that would help us persuade ministers, if we can find one, and it's a good thing to do?
Well, I think one easy, quick thing to say is that we are almost the only country that doesn't have a National Institute for Forensic Science. So that to go alongside that, there's no ministerial responsibility. There really isn't a kind of focal home place for forensic science to be embedded, and then to advocate for itself, to demonstrate its value, to argue for investment. One of the things is, well, who is arguing for this? I mean, we've had your report, we've had reports before it, we've had our report, but actually who is taking this and then driving it through? I think a National Institute would be a galvanising thing, that then we could bring the brightest minds together, we could have a forensic science home, and then push forward from there.
We have questions about the National Institute coming up, so perhaps we can
yeah.
move on. we've got so many questions for the three of you, and we're getting such interesting responses, but we have got to try to move a little bit more briefly, if we can at all possible, please. Professor Nick Daeid, we're conscious that we lost connection with you. We're sorry about that.
I was wondering, was it something that I had said?
We're very pleased that you're reconnected with us. The next question is coming from Baroness Walmsley.
Thank you, Chair. You've all mentioned, and indeed Baroness Black mentioned last week, the major challenge with forensic science in the UK being the asymmetry between the ability of the prosecution and the ability of the defence to access forensic science. And your report says that the long-term goal should be the removal of forensic science provision from police oversight altogether. So can you set out firstly what challenges are there for the quality of provision under the current model and the risks to independence? And secondly, how removing forensic science provision from police oversight could actually work in practice? It occurs to me that there may be considerable resistance from the police, presumably because the budget would be removed as well, or perhaps they may be very glad to get rid of it. And certainly I'd be very interested to know what the court's attitude would be to that. And perhaps Professor Nick Daeid can tell us how the Scots managed to achieve that transition from the police to independence. So perhaps we could start with Professor McCartney.
Yes, so one of the big problems is there's been a big shift, of course, with regulation. So now everybody having to be accredited, which has been very burdensome on, small companies or even sole traders. So it's had a real impact on the defence expertise side of things. So previously, where a solicitor could get the police forensic reports and so forth and then say, well, I'm going to now take this and get my own defence experts, there's really no defence experts left to be found, and that's for a series of reasons, not just at the cost of accreditation, but the legal aid agency is almost impossible to work with if you speak to solicitors, because you have to get 3 quotes. Well, of course, you've got to find 3 experts, and that's very difficult. Then they will only ever go with price. And then we get here repeatedly that they then haggle on the price. So they will knock down the quotes of the lowest quote. And so solicitors very often don't have the time and the money, and experts haven't got the time or the money. They're doing this pro bono very often. And one of the difficulties, of course, is the chicken and the egg problem we have, because to demonstrate to the legal aid agency that you need an expert, you have to demonstrate to them why you need that expert. But until you've had an expert tell you that, this needs some expertise. So solicitors are just avoiding this. And of course, the problem with the courts is now, we need to get these things moving along quickly, trying to find experts, trying to get 3 quotes, trying to get an expert who'll work for the pitiful fees that they're paid, and then you won't get paid for 2 years anyway. All of this means the defence market has crashed, and it's really, really difficult to get expertise in England and Wales.
Professor Nick Daeid, would you like to comment?
Yes, absolutely. I think the challenge here is around culture as much as it is around anything else. In Scotland, when we moved from a number of police forces to one single police force, there was a big cultural shift across the police organisations themselves as they needed to amalgamate and coalesce in terms of procedures, practices, etc. And that caused them a real moment for thought and for pause. It caused them the requirement to develop leadership in a way that perhaps it had been siloed before. But at the same time in Scotland, we have, of course, a different judicial system. So we have our Lord President and Lord Justice Clark, who head up the judicial services, and we have our own prosecutorial service led by the Lord Advocate. Within the forensic science provision, we have one forensic science laboratory, as you know, that is part of or works within an organisation called the Scottish Police Authority. So that looks after Police Scotland and it looks after the Forensic Science Laboratory, but there is what is called a sterile corridor in between the two. And what that means is that one is not driven by the other. The laboratory does not just do work for the prosecution, it does work for the criminal justice system. So it looks at both sides of the argument with regards, as I said earlier, to the items recovered from scenes and what work is done on them. But what it does do across this whole landscape, when you throw in the academic community and also, of course, the research community led by our own centre, really, in order to make a decision about something, you need 5 people at the table. And that really changes the way in which a system can work with agility, and it changes the way in which people automatically work together. Because there's a real culture of collaboration in Scotland for the benefit of the people of Scotland. And that means that sometimes difficult questions are asked. And it sometimes means that there needs to be a considerable amount of discussion, collaboration, critical thinking across the whole of the criminal justice space, and that involves the defence side of the house as well. So while it's not perfect, the lines of communication, I think, are much more collaborative up here in the frozen north than they are down in England and Wales, simply because that's what we've created. But it has taken us some time and some pain to get there. But it is a system that does work. The co-location of the Forensic Science Laboratory, some of Police Scotland, and also the prosecutorial system in one place at Gartcosh, at the crime campus, also helps. But as I said, there's a real spirit of collaborative endeavour here that brings together all of the players to help move the criminal justice system forward and for science to truly serve that its purpose within that system.
So in light of that, could you tell us whether the Scottish judiciary have been supportive of that transition, how it has affected them?
I work quite closely with the judiciary, but I would never even attempt to speak on their behalf, of course. But in our workings with the judiciary, they are very impressed with the provision of forensic science up in Scotland. That doesn't mean that they blindly accept it. They will test it. Of course they will. And they have an expectation that the prosecutorial and defence services indeed will test it. Within our research centre, we bring the Scottish judiciary and the judiciary from England and Wales and Northern Ireland together with scientists, whether they're at the bench or whether they're in leadership positions, together with the prosecutors and defenders to discuss matters like this in strategic conversations. So there is a very warm, collaborative mood in Scotland, I would say. As I said, it's not perfect. No system is going to be, but it is one where we are all aiming at the same place, and that is to have science serve justice as best it can.
Professor Gallop, anything to add before we move on?
It's quite interesting, actually, because what Niamh's talking about there is sort of some of the function that we envisage for the National Forensic Science Institute in England and Wales. Interesting.
Okay, thank you. Viscount Stansgate.
Well, this is not quite the frozen south, incidentally, not at the moment. I wanted to ask about another challenge that has been brought to our attention. Please confirm if our understanding is correct, which is the extinction or depletion of forensic science specialisms in certain areas, for example, fibre analysis, blood pattern analysis and toxicology. Can you explain, if this is true, why it's happening in your view? What could be done to ensure that some of these vital specialisms are retained? And would it be true to say, in the light of some of your earlier comments, that some of the very high-profile miscarriages of justice that you mentioned that were successes for the Forensic Science Service might now in future not be possible because of the loss of these specialisms?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the sort of the situation with, we're calling them niche areas now, they never used to be niche, but these niche areas, they came about because of all the things that we've been talking about. It's the focus on tests, and it's the focus on one or two types of tests, particularly 3 kinds of evidence: digital and fingerprints and DNA, to almost the exclusion in average casework, most cases, of anything else. And so as the requirement for these other areas has dropped, so it's become impossible for suppliers to maintain the sort of laboratories and the number of scientists and so on that they used to have. And to the extent that some of the things, some of these areas of expertise we're losing altogether. I remember in the 2000s it was possible then to build in new expertise into forensic science laboratories. And in the laboratory I was responsible for, we, for example, brought in, we called it forensic ecology. It was a new area. And in that we had soils and we had insects and we had plants, vegetation, pollen, all kinds of things in there, which were, it was a small unit, but, was very valuable when it was required. We also got closer to forensic pathologists, and we started making sure that they managed their work more professionally, gave them a bit of support to do that, and we built them a special archive for their samples that was properly temperature controlled and all the rest of it. So instead of them keeping it in there under their beds and in their garages, it was now properly stored. And so we did things like that. We set up a new laboratory within the Royal Armouries, and so we could make use of the Royal Armouries specialists. It's still there. It's a really brilliant collaboration between forensic science and sort of slightly different interests. So we were doing all of that sort of thing, but all of that got stripped away, or has got stripped away over the last couple of decades. So it's now, we're a shadow of a former selves, I would say. To the extent that now the major supplier with 86% of the market still has a laboratory where you can get textile fibres done. So it still has one. But we used to, as 10, 15 years ago, we had about 40 fibre scientists. Now we have, dedicated, probably four or five, something like that. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale at which we've lost some of these things. So I'm sorry, I can't remember what the rest of your question was.
Well, it's also, for all of you, what you think you would recommend should be done to reverse the decline in these vital specialisms, and to what extent you would genuinely say, looking to the future, that there might be grave miscarriages of justice waiting us in the future for lack of these specialisms.
Well, I think we would never have solved the cases. Well, I mentioned two of them, but I'm sure there are others.
Which two are you thinking of?
Stephen Lawrence and the Coastal Path murders. We would never have done that without textile fibres. We'd given up looking for body fluids and DNA, and it was only because we were doing textile fibres, and that's very microscopic, so you see things that you wouldn't normally see in that we discovered.
Well, that's two pretty important cases.
Oh, well, absolutely, and there'll be others. I'm just not...
So Nick Daeid, would you like to come in on this? Just that moment.
Maybe not.
All right, but...
I was going to say, I like that we're using the word specialisms, because as Angela said, they're very often now referred to as niches, and I think that's an almost pernicious word to use, because then, of course, it makes it sound like, well, it's something you don't really need very often. It used to be just part of forensic science, but now huge swathes of forensic science are called niche, and then, very tiny, and there's hardly any of it going on. One big problem we have is with the inexperience and the overworking of police detectives. So we don't have enough detectives, and they don't have enough experience, so they don't know about niche areas or specialisms. They know, you can do DNA testing, you can do toxicology, and of course the big thing we have now is digital, and we're repeatedly hearing this mantra, it's become now 90% of cases have digital evidence, and it's driving behaviours. So now I talk to police officers and they say, well, in every investigation we're being expected to hand over phones and computers and do digital testing on it, where actually you could probably use other techniques, but we're so focused in on digital, and it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they're just getting digital forensics and then saying, oh, now we solve everything using digital forensics. But there's a lot of risks attached to that because it's not particularly well regulated and they've got huge problems in digital forensics. But not everything can be solved by seizing somebody's smartphone. You still need all these other techniques and technologies. And yes, undoubtedly, I would put my life savings on. We will have miscarriages of justice in the future that we will not be able to solve because we don't have the expertise or we haven't got the evidence because we didn't seize it in the first place. We've already had a miscarriage of justice overturned, but we had to go to Germany for the experts.
Professor Nick Daeid, we were just about to ask you to come in, and I'm afraid we cut you off again. So, on specialisms.
I have to say, poor Thomas, thank you so much for keep reconnecting us together. He's doing a sterling job there behind the lines. I think the niche areas, Angela mentioned fibres, but there's also paint, glass, some of the other areas of what would be described in old-fashioned language as criminalistics. And we're certainly losing the expertise in England and Wales. We're not in Scotland. We're maintaining that expertise up here, as indeed are, as far as I understand, our colleagues in Northern Ireland who have a system and a model not dissimilar from that here in Scotland. There's a real risk, and again, I would absolutely echo what my colleagues have said. As the world around us changes, so too does the paint and the glass and the fibres that we encounter in casework. And if we don't maintain the expertise, the skill, the research, and the development and the understanding of these materials, then we will lose the ability to use that evidence type in a particular way. And fibre evidence in particular is extremely powerful evidence, or can be. I think there's another element that we're also perhaps not yet touching upon, and we might do so, and that is, it's not just about finding these things, these traces, it's about understanding what does it mean to find them in the place where we found them, whether that's DNA or whether it's a fibre or other materials. And so the research work that needs to be done in the transfer and the persistence, or the persistence and the transfer of these materials, is only embryonic. And without that information, we cannot answer some of the questions that are put to us by the courts, which is, did this particular individual, was that particular individual involved in the activity as alleged? And so some of the areas and the skill set that forensic scientists bring to bear is being simply eroded. And I would go back to perhaps an analogy. We've been talking about forensic science as if it's a single thing, and forensic scientists as if they just do one thing. And of course they don't. It'd be, the analogy might be if you had a tradesperson come to your house and you think that they're just a tradesperson that's going to fix your plumbing, but you call a plasterer to do it, then your plumbing's not going to get fixed. So we need to have scientists who are expert in fibres and textile fibres and their analysis as much as we need chemists and biologists, I would say. And we are losing that ability in England and Wales, not elsewhere, but certainly in England and Wales at the moment.
Unless Young, you had a brief question.
This is a question that Professor Nick Daeid might not know the answer to, but I'll ask anyway. And if not, perhaps we could be directed to where the answer might be found. And that is, how comparative are the funding levels per head of population for forensics in Scotland and Northern Ireland compared with England and Wales? Does it come down to the fact that, as usual, I should say this because I'm a Scot, the Barnett formula has lucked out Scotland, and therefore it's got more money to spend on this, as well as the very valid organisational differences that you've pointed out?
I think it's a really interesting question. You're correct. I don't have the answer to it. I'm Irish and live in Scotland, so I have a double challenge here in terms of just working that out. I think there has been some economics done on it, but I'm not sure what they are. Part of what there is an opportunity to speak to is about preventative spend, and one of my colleagues mentioned it a bit earlier, and that is, how much money will we save if we do forensic science, or forensic science contributes in a more holistic way to a given case, but more than just let's answer a test. And Angela spoke to this also alongside myself earlier. Forensic science isn't about that. It's about the process of starting thinking science at the crime scene, then thinking about the case circumstances, then looking at what test or set of tests is the most appropriate, and then looking at how do we articulate that within the context of the framework of a case in the courtroom. And so it's this whole process that we need to look at. In terms of how much money will we save by getting this process right so that we don't have miscarriages of justice, or indeed that we can reduce crime because we're better at solving it, is a question that is a really interesting one to ask. In some areas, particularly around the analysis of drugs, and particularly in toxicological analysis, up here we're combining forces with public health to try to reduce drug taking. And that benefits, of course, enormously in terms of the provision of toxicology services, but also in the way in which the data is used. So it's not just used for one purpose. It's used for more than one purpose, and that has a greater societal benefit because the information that's produced by our forensic toxicologists feeds into public health information to try to reduce drug taking and drug death. And so there's a synergy, a symbiosis, if you will, between how data that's generated for one purpose can then be used for another. And I think that creates a greater societal benefit and value to the cost of those tests within the different agencies and organizations. So it's quite a complex picture, but it is a very interesting question. And you're absolutely right. I do not have an answer for it, than my musings.
Well, if you could find the answer, it'd be wonderful. But
I should do my best.
It may be difficult. On the question of funding, Baroness Northover has some more questions.
Yes, and I was actually going to ask exactly what Baroness Young has said, because it sounds as if we've got a model in Scotland, which is and Northern Ireland, which is working better, and that is very, very helpful. That we can draw from those, and I would be very interested in the answer to the question that Baroness Young has just put. Which I've noted down here, which was the cost per head comparatively between Scotland and England and Wales. I remember, post the banking crash and austerity and so on, and the pressure to close quangos and such like, and the debate over what's happened in terms of forensic science in the UK. I've been struck by the fact that our witnesses have not felt that in itself was necessarily a retrograde step, that the market initially seemed to work, but then it didn't. Because, of course, at the time, I remember lots of debate as to whether it would work. And in the end, it hasn't worked. And so, clearly, in terms of funding, I mean, in the question I've got in front of me, as it were, there's a question about does it need more central funding from the Home Office? But as you rightly point out, that all the other pressures, both on MOJ and the Home Office, the police, and so on, and so that isn't a simple ask. What I'm wondering is how you think this might be structured. I heard the point about public health. Public health in the UK hasn't been ring-fenced in England and Wales in the way that the NHS was. So public health has been under pressure. Environmental regulations and how that's implemented, that's been under pressure. So how do you actually take this forward into something which is workable, given all the other pressures in terms of the Home Office and MOJ, not least what we are seeing at the moment in terms of the MOJ's concern about prisoners being released and huge public anxiety about that. So where do you fit in something which may come down the track in terms of miscarriages of justice a long time into the future? So how, in terms of the financial model, would you see this being taken through?
I think one of the biggest issues that needs to be tackled first, and this relates to the early part of the discussion, was the impact of forensic science is very difficult to articulate. So there was a project undertaken by Marie Barrett at the Home Office during COVID, unfortunately, so it stumbled for those reasons. but a real attempt to try and gauge the impact that forensic science had, to put in concrete terms in front of people that, you know, if you invest in forensic science, you get a massive return on your investment. It is highly, highly complex, and her team went quite a long way down the line, but we didn't really, the project ended before we kind of got to an end point where we could say, and one of the things we've recommended is that work needs to be picked up again, because one of the difficulties is it's too easy to sideline forensic science when people don't appreciate its value, because they don't understand, well, this would be useful, this is a good place to invest our money. One of the other difficulties is it's almost impossible to know how much money is being spent. So we have a colleague, Tiernan Coyle, who's been spending all of his free time at the moment doing freedom of information requests to 43 police forces, asking, please tell me how much you spend on forensic science, and it's almost impossible to get the answer. And some of them spend it under capital expenditure, and others spend it on... It's so complex, and there's no transparency. So we don't actually know. I mean, we know how much the private providers are saying the market is worth, about 100 million, but how that's actually spent. And of course, we've got a lot of investment going into the police. There's a lot of work being done on science and technology. So I was at a meeting last week, and they said we spend £2 billion on science and technology in policing. Sadly, 97% of that is spent trying to keep systems going because they're so old and creaking at the seams. But there's a lot of money being spent, and then there's a lot of innovation going on in science and technology in policing. The difficulty is forensic science is seen as a very distant cousin to that agenda, and it's very peripheral. So I think I'm almost more frightened that forensic science is going to get even more sidelined, because we're going AI, digital, let's get all the facial recognition vans around the country. All the money's being spent in that, and we're starving yet further forensic science because we haven't got a way of demonstrating the return on investment.
Mr. Gallop, you want to comment?
And if we had a National Forensic Science Institute, it's one of the things that they could be looking at, or trying to make sure there was much better clarity and awareness of you know, what's involved.
And that would join up England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, would it, that national one?
Well, it could do, absolutely.
Well, we hope they'd speak to us.
Probably should do.
Absolutely.
I'm sure Niamh would speak to us.
Got a long history of collaboration.
Professor Nick Daeid, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I think that there are definitely synergies and opportunities to look at a broader definition of forensic science. We did this in the Sydney Declaration paper that I mentioned earlier for a reason, and that reason was that forensic science can be, the approach of a forensic scientist can be brought to other areas of practice that equally require an understanding of detection, recognition, recovery, examination, and communication of the outputs of interpretation of data that's done in context. So that sits very nicely within public health, and it sits very nicely in environmental sciences as well. So there is an opportunity, as many of our colleagues in Europe do, of combining forces together, so that there are other ways in which the application of our sciences can be used to good advantage. I think that in the work that we've done here in the Leverhulme Centre over the last 9 years has charted a journey through this set of strategic conversations I spoke of earlier, where we've brought the voices of science and law specifically together, not always policing in that discussion, in order that we can have frank discussions between the scientists who do the science and the lawyers and judiciary who use the science to public good, to say what are the problems that we think that we have, and how can we collaboratively and collectively work together to try to propose a set of solutions, whether that requires research from academic or practice, whether it requires public engagement or science communication, whether it requires investment, or whether what we've got already exists somewhere else and we can go off like little magpies and take science that's being done elsewhere it in a way that secures it for our own industry. So yes, we need investment, but we also need to be smart about how we choose to use that funding and that investment, because money is tight everywhere. And in order to do that, we really need to combine forces, think about what it is that actually ails us and how we can work together across that whole community of practice, crime scene to courtroom, involving the public, where appropriate and necessary, to actually make the best use of what we can do. Science should be with the scientists. That's what scientists do best. We're very good at it. But controlling what it is that other people think that we need to do is not going to work. We might not need technology. Science needs to come before technology, so that we know that we're taking technology, either developing it ourselves or taking technology that others have developed, and we're using it in a way that's fit for purpose for our justice system. A good example is cell site analysis, where we borrowed something from a different industry and tried to get it to do something that it wasn't designed to do, which is to pinpoint accurately where a mobile phone is. That's not how cell sites work. And so, or at least not what they were designed to do. And so we have to be really careful about just adopting the new thing without deeply thinking about whether or not it's worth our while doing so. And that it helps the justice system, which is what, of course, we all want to do.
I can't stand Daeid.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions about the forensic science regulator and accreditation. How difficult is it for the forensic science regulator to enforce standards for forensic science provision? Are there enough resources for this to be effective, in your view? How effective is the current accreditation process? And should expert witnesses be accredited? So whoever would like to start on that, those are 4 quick questions.
Well, I think one difficulty is even answering the question, because it's very difficult to make an assessment of how easy is it to accredit things. Again, I think an assessment should be made at this point probably of how successful the forensic science regulator has been. We know they've had repeated problems with police accreditation. Police have set up laboratories, or they've had, fingerprint bureau and so forth, and they haven't been able to get accredited. We've now had the problem of crime scene examination being accredited, but then having huge adverse consequences on the capacity of crime scene examination to actually undertake crime scene. And so that, I believe, has now been suspended because of the problems with it, that it's actually putting a real stop or creating real obstacles to efficient crime scene examination. I think the forensic science regulator has had a big impact, considering it's got quite actually a very limited remit. And you talk about expert witnesses. Well, I mean, a lot of the problems with forensic science are nothing to do with laboratories, and they're nothing to do with forensic scientists. And that's where the forensic science regulators really is focused on accrediting laboratories and techniques and technologies and so forth. But a lot of the problems are with disclosure still. A lot of the problems are with the fact that there simply isn't access to a defence expert. There's a lot of problems with, we've got the criminal procedure rules and we've got the criminal practice directions, but they're not actually being used to great effect. So even now you can speak to criminal barristers. I know I trained some last year, and I asked them at the start, who's used the criminal practice directions, the sections on checking for experts and reliability. And about 70% of them say, no, never used it, it's never come up. They're simply not using the tools that are actually already there to gauge reliability and check for expertise. And of course, I've already pinpointed the problems with legal aid, and that an awful lot of forensic scientists are working pro bono, or they don't get things disclosed to them. We heard of a case where prosecution experts turned up at a trial. They met with the defence experts before the trial, which is ideal, which is what we all want. And it turned out that the defence experts had more access to evidence than the prosecution experts had. And once they had a conversation, the prosecution realised that, well, their findings were now all incorrect in light of what the defence told them, and so the trial collapses.
What's the answer to Viscount Stansgate's question? Should expert witnesses themselves be accredited?
We have tried that with the CRFP and it didn't work, and I'm not sure we have a way to do that. They do it in Norway, we could perhaps look over there. They do it in the Netherlands, but it's very, very difficult to do, and I wouldn't personally recommend it.
Mr. Gallop?
Well, I think we should have it. And I think, unfortunately, the CRFP, which started in 2000 and then was closed down in 2009, was just beginning to get somewhere, and judges were just beginning to ask witnesses as they gave evidence, are you accredited through the CRFP? And so it was just happening then. But I think that the Home Office wanted it to be self-funding, and of course the forensic science community is so small that was probably never really going to happen. And that's why it was closed down at the end of the day. But for me and for other forensic scientists, it was such a shame, because suddenly we were thrust back into where we were in the 70s and 80s, where anybody could stand up and say that they were a forensic scientist. And some academics were, forgive me, Carole, had splendid backgrounds, and they sounded as if they'd been wonderful. But actually, in terms of practical experience and the kinds of evidence that they would be talking about, they didn't really have any experience of that at all. And so it was just, and then there were lots of charlatans as well, just people who thought, well, I'll say I'm an expert in this, it'll be fine, and not realising the damage that they were potentially doing.
Are there still charlatans?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Why wouldn't there be? There's no left to the courts, how do the courts know whether someone who's got brilliant academic qualifications, how do they know whether or not they're able to judge in a scientific evidence in the way that they need to be able to? So I'm absolutely certain that our courts suffer from them every now and again. They're bound to.
Accreditation would be a way of preventing that problem.
Yes, of some kind. And it is all about proportionality, I think, and you just have to work out what it is that you actually need. The CRFP was so good because scientists were peer reviewing other scientists. And that meant that people who knew what they were doing were actually, instead of, for example, lawyers trying to work out whether they've got a good scientist, and they would probably only know if they had some successes in cases in the past, and who knows what those successes might have been based on, so it was all a bit difficult. The other thing I wanted to say was that the fees that UCAS, the accreditation service, charges for accrediting laboratories are absolutely huge, and I think something needs to be done with that, and that might help with both laboratories but also the police getting accreditation if that was looked into. And
how do you distinguish? Accrediting laboratories is one thing.
Yes.
Accrediting individual is another.
Absolutely, but they sort of cross over. I mean, what they do at the moment is that when they're accrediting laboratories, they look at training records and they look at things like that relating to scientists and see whether they should be all right, and their proficiency test record and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a bit of a fuzzy area at the edges there.
Professor Nick Daeid.
Yes, so I was a lead assessor for CRFP back in the day, and I do certainly advocate that there's a necessity for assessing that an expert is able to provide their expertise in a way that brings together both their experience and their scientific understanding and credentials, etc. And it's the two together that really provides an opportunity to assess whether or not that individual is competent or maintains their competency in a particular area. I also act as a technical assessor for ISO 17025, not in this country, but in the Republic of Ireland. So I also agree with what Angela has said in that the two things there's a connectivity between the two, but UCAS or ISO 17025, while it requires people to be competent, it doesn't necessarily test that competence per se. On the one hand, in other organizations professional disciplines, our professional bodies would provide that level of reassurance that an individual not only has the academic training but can also deliver in practice. So the Institute for Engineers, the Royal Society of Chemistry, and so on have got chartered status for their members. Indeed, I'm a CChem, a chartered chemist, so that you get a badge, as it were, for the kind of root discipline that you come from, and there are requirements to maintain professional development and so on and so forth. And we do have a Chartered Society of Forensic Science, our professional body across the forensic sciences, that also has an opportunity, I think, to try to drive the delivery potentially of some sort of assurance or reassurance. Although this is complicated because there's so many different bits of us. As I said earlier, plumbers and carpenters, etc. It's challenging to do. The different discipline areas are trying to do it to some degree. But a number of years ago, I worked with the fire investigation community. Part of my stock and trade as a forensic practitioner is fire investigation, and was really quite taken aback to understand that approximately 90+% of fires are investigated by people with less than a day's training in fire investigation. And that's the world that we live in some areas. And so we, as professional practitioners in these discipline areas, we need to have reassurance, and indeed the courts need to have reassurance, that what we're delivering is what we're bringing is people who really know this business and have the competence through training, education, but also experience, that they bring that to bear to the challenge ahead of them. And the real challenge, or one of the challenges around competence and maintaining of competence in England and Wales specifically, is the churn of the workforce. And as more people with a lot of experience have left the workforce and people with a lot less experience, not necessarily less scientific training, come into the workforce, you have that loss of competence that I think is a real challenge. But equally, forensic scientists bring their scientific curiosity to the table. And we can only do that if we're given the opportunity to actually be scientists, have that curious nature when sometimes we get something that we've never seen before. Back to Angela's China cups of earlier, that we've never seen before, that we have to try to really use science to try to figure out what we're doing. So it's a mixture of all of these things. It's not just getting a badge to say, I can analyse a drug. It's broader than that in terms of the competence that a forensic scientist needs to have, I would say.
Okay, sounds good.
Just one quick point, Professor. You mentioned the RSC Chartered Chemist qualification. Can I ask you where in this whole area, in your view, public analysts sit? Because they also are, in fact, members of the Royal Society of Chemistry. And is there any relevance you'd like to bring to the attention of this committee of the work that they do, given that, as I understand it, they are a somewhat declining band?
That's a very good question. It's not one I can give you a very succinct answer to, but I think that the role of the public analyst is one that is really important. I think that they are, as you said, also many of them chartered chemists, and the chartered chemist status gives you a credibility and a reassurance that you're a chemist in practice. You're somebody who practices your craft and does so by a regular basis, but also that you maintain continuous professional development and the other elements and hallmarks of a professional practitioner. I think the question about public analysts is something that I can't directly answer for you, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
We're going to come on to National Institute for Forensic Science, the proposal for that. But before, Baroness Northover, you want to come in on this?
I just wanted to come in on this point. I've been wondering, as you've been talking about medical experts. Now that field is sustainable. Now, obviously, doctors practicing take out expensive medical insurance, and then there's the NHS paying out for things too. But medical experts are playing a major role in cases. So so both in terms of the regulation and also the funding, I'm just wondering whether there's anything that can be drawn out of that model, which is, as it were, working from the point of view of winning cases, as it were, into what you're talking about here.
I think you need to be very careful with medical experts, because actually when you say it's working, there's an awful lot of people would argue that it's not working terribly well at all. And obviously there are obvious cases that are in the press regularly where, I mean, the British Medical Association have got another histopathologists under investigation now who's been going around the country testifying repeatedly in cases where children have broken bones, and it's found that he doesn't have the expertise that he's been claiming. So there are real problems with the charlatans, should we say, in the medical field as well. There are certain... there's been reports, and the Hillsborough law might be useful here in terms of also bringing some responsibility to bear, that there has to be candour and so forth. But in the medical field, there are real question marks over people, particularly who retire or people who move out of the field and then set themselves up as experts and then work as expert witnesses, rather than their medical practitioners who happen to be drawn into a case. There are people who make a very good living out of being experts, and I think that's highly questionable.
Okay.
Medical experts tend to get paid an awful lot more than forensic scientists.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes.
Lord Ranger,
Professor, thank you so much for this crash course in forensic science. To a layperson, I can't say I'm in any way near an expert or aware of this area in detail, but what I am aware of is about how you lobby for funding and government attention, and in part of my career I've had to do a bit of that. And before I get on to the question about the Institute, I was not for this inquiry, and I'll tell you why. 7 reports since 2005 and not much changing makes me question why we would do another report. So part of the question is, what should be different this time? For example, you were mentioning, Professor McCartney, that it's nearly impossible to get the figure for pound invested and return. Well, unless you have that figure, it's going to be really difficult to get political attention, and you don't have a minister, you don't have noise, we can say everything we want to say. Without that information, it's hard to make the argument. So I would really stress, I think we need to look at that. And then the question about the National Institute, which was recommended in the 2019 report and hasn't been taken up. Is there a specification that you have for what that institute, the exact functions that that institute would discharge, and how it would operate? And maybe that has changed since the report in 2019, because times have changed, and there is a different world. And that world does include a lot of technology. And I did hear, I think, Professor Nick Daeid say, it's not about the technology. It is about the technology now. And I think that there may be a need to embrace what's happening in the world of technology. And how would that institute do that, both in terms of research, expertise, but also a key point of storage of information and data and archiving? Has that been specced out? Is that something that has been looked at again in the current context of where things are?
Well, in terms of exact specifications, obviously we've just written this report in our spare time and as a hobby, and so we haven't had the time, and nor probably should it fall to us to say what the exact parameters ought to be. That needs to be a conversation really with the community and with police stakeholders and so forth. But some things we have set out is that there's always a complaint about a disjoint between research that's done and then operationalising of research. And so police will always tell you, but academics don't do the research that we want done. And then academics will tell you, well, we can't get access to real-world data and real-world cases that we can help on and so forth. So it's about breaking down those barriers, which they've started doing. The Chief Scientific Office of the Police have started doing that now with these policing academic centres of excellence. So it's being driven that police and academics have to work together and we have to collaborate on research. And technology, yes, you're right, and some of the difficulties is some techniques require very expensive kit. And then if there's no investment in it, then why is a forensic provider going to spend the money on that kit? But if you could have like a national resource, and of course sometimes it's a medical bit of kit or it's a bit of kit that these people over here are using for something else. But occasionally a forensic scientist might say, please could I borrow your, and Angela and Niamh could fit in the technical term of an expensive microscope here or something, or some bit of technology. But forensic scientists can't maintain it on their own because they wouldn't be using it often enough. So I think there's an important role the Institute could play on having access to the technology that forensic science couldn't justify on its own, but it could use it as and when it required it. So that was a couple of important things, I think. Focusing on a national strategy for research, so highlighting the areas of research interest that have been co-produced with all the stakeholders, but making sure as well you can do blue skies, horizon scanning, do ground truth database work and so forth, the non-sexy things that don't get funded, all of those things, and then maintaining technology. There are a couple of things I think would be the top of the to-do list of any institute.
Would the National Institute have a role in archive evidence? We've heard some rather alarming reports that a lot of potential archive evidence has been lost or damaged. Would that be a function of your proposed National Institute?
I don't think so. We actually already have a forensic archive, and of course I've done a lot of research on police evidence with a colleague of mine, Louise Shorter, and there desperately needs to be something done about evidence retaining of materials, because with the closure of the FSS, it got dispersed to every police force to now keep their own investigative materials. It's very costly and they're not experts in how to do it. So really, we should just take it off them. It's not something individual police forces should be doing. They haven't got the expertise and the money. So either you expand the forensic archive we already have, which was just for forensic science service materials. It's been opened once because a company went bankrupt and they archived their materials. But you could expand that or create a national archive.
Who's responsible for the National Archive, such as it is now?
Home Office.
The Home Office.
On a tiny budget because it's very small and they have to argue for the money every year.
And the loss or damage of evidence is down to that archive not being well managed?
But it's not the forensic archive that's not managed, it's the archive, the storage facilities of each police force, because they've cobbled together. I mean, I've been round, there are some that have invested in it, but it requires a big investment. And of course, if you're looking at policing, then building a big storage facility is not obviously top of a list of many people's priorities, many forces' priorities. Some of them are just old cell blocks that they've turned into cupboards.
Professor Nick Daeid, the Scottish experience, tell us about that.
So in Scotland, we have worked, I think, very hard together over the last number of years, particularly since the advent of the funding for the Leverhulme Centre, to determine the research strategy required in terms of going forward to benefit the criminal justice system. And I agree with Carole. The approach that we have always taken is to be completely inclusive of the whole of the stakeholders within that system, whether they be judges, lawyers, police officers, forensic scientists, or indeed members of the public, because their voice is important here as well. And that's developed a whole set of strands of research that our colleagues now within the academy undertake in lockstep with the practitioners. And so that it bears an enormous amount of fruit. The Scottish Police Authority Forensic Sciences Lab up here is also developing its own research, development and innovation strategy over the next number of years and presenting that to those that pay them. So there is a cohesive strategic direction that is going forward that intercalates the forensic science or the scientific provision with not just the needs of policing, but also with the needs of the broader criminal justice system, and of course the scientific needs as well. In terms of technology introduction, I wouldn't say we should not introduce any technology. Of course I wouldn't, but I think we need to introduce technology that's relevant, and we need to make sure that that technology is fit for our purpose. And I'll give you an example of perhaps some unintended consequences. As we developed DNA technology over the years to make it much, much more sensitive, the consequence of that was complex or mixed DNA profiles, which we needed then to work out how to unmix. And the unmixing of those DNA profiles has caused us another whole set of circumstances, because we use algorithms to do the unmixing and commercial software to generate or to make those algorithms work. And so you start to get different results coming out of the same data, but tested by different sets of algorithms. So an unintended consequence of a rampant drive forward with technology needs to mean something for us. So we need to kind of think and pause about what it is that we might want to do. Having a technology base that is specific for its purposes, working with industry to not just use something that they've already created, but we use it for a different purpose, but to work hand in glove with them to create new products and innovations that we require, such that we can make best use of technology advancements, particularly in nanotechnology and other sort of areas like that, that will work for us. We don't have to have things that are the most sensitive instruments going. We have to have things that will work in our really messy, horrible environments in crime scenes, such that we can derive from it the information that's required, but also, with a weather eye to the future, gather the right things at these crime scenes in order that we can preserve them so that we can test them in the future with as technology moves forward and develops. To look at archives, I think there are two different types of things. There's the archive that stores stuff, so materials recovered from crime scenes or from individuals. And then there's archives that store data. And as we progress with looking and exploring at how we can use things like machine learning and artificial intelligence to our advantage, then data becomes key and becomes king. We're not very good in this country at storing data relevant to forensic science. What I mean by that is we're not very good at generating it. So we can use our PhD students to generate what we call ground truth data, data that we know where it comes from. And we can create large amounts of that data, and then we can make that data available. Our centre does that on a routine basis. But there's also huge amounts of data tied up in our laboratories. Data from old tests, let's say, of footwear marks or sole patterns of shoes that have been gathered over the decades or over many years that are just sitting there. And if we make that data available in cases that are disposed of, and we mine that data and create data lakes and data architectures, whereby we can then use that data to provide large amounts of information to the academic community to generate AI models that will do what we want them to do, then we're in business. And I would draw your analogy to the way, again in Scotland, but it's dealt elsewhere, that public health data or medical data is being used to provide innovations, for example, in using AI to identify breast cancer or using AI to identify glaucomas. And it's because data that's gathered has been secured in data lakes and then trusted data environments used to enable academics to do research on that information. So that's what we should be doing. That's what our institute should be doing.
Are you saying that the real problem is data storage rather than the blood-stained T-shirt?
I think it's a matter of both. I think that there's storage for items, for exhibits that are collected at or productions that are collected at crime scenes, which our current Forensic Science Archive it retains some of, and it's the kind of material that Carole was talking about that the police are holding on to. But there's also then the data derived from the examination of those items, as well as the data that's held in forensic science laboratories.
Anything to add, Professor Gallop?
Well, just that I think that the archive we've got at the moment, that built from after the demise of the Forensic Science Service, after many years, is now a really good archive, and so it would make an excellent base to be expanded. And it is really important to keep these physical items, so that if somebody is saying, I didn't do it, it's a miscarriage of justice, or if you want to go back and try and reinvestigate a case, so you've got the raw material to do that from. This is really, really critical. And I just wanted to make a point about research and development. You've also got to make sure that the potential users of what you're doing are really keyed into the whole project and are actually going to use it. Because I can think of 3 research projects, huge research projects that private companies did. The police all the time were saying, yes, it's exactly what we need. And then when the time came, can we trial it now because we've got it to a certain stage? They said, well, actually, when that force uses it, or, we're not quite ready for it. And so it was just a horror show on 3 separate occasions. and some really, really good technology, and so you just have to be really careful about that.
Can I just quickly say that the Law Commission of England and Wales have made recommendations about an archive in their appeals inquiry, so they're already making recommendations and looking at that area too.
Okay, thank you. That's useful. Baroness Willis.
So I've got a question, but just if I can just follow on from that previous point. So where do you envisage this archive? I'm trying to think about, okay, what are the solutions here? How do we actually turn this around? It's a very, we're hearing so many very sort of depressing anecdotes, and I'm just trying to think, well, what would be good for us to be able to recommend as to the way to do this? So if you were to have an archive, would it be, is that a physical archive? Would it need to be someone like the National Archives, or where would you place it, and what sort of size and facility are you thinking about? And maybe Professor Daeid could comment on that.
Yes, certainly. I think that there are two different elements. One is the archive that Angela was talking about, which is an archive for physical things, items of clothing, different items recovered from a scene, to keep those physical things in such a way that the integrity of them is maintained, such that in the future we may have tests that we can use on them, or if there is a question over whether or not there might be tests that could have been done that were not, then that can be revisited. So that's one. The second, I think, is an archive or a repository for the data that forensic science laboratories are generating through casework, but also that the academic institutions are generating through research work. That should be a national asset, in my view, and it is a data storage facility. So that could be a computer or a series of servers, but we need a national asset such that we can then provide access through the trusted research environment, for example, in the same way that medical research works, to enable further research, particularly around leveraging machine learning applications, if that's a direction of travel we want to go in the future, and it seems a sensible one to take. But making it a national asset then should create a means or mechanism whereby governments can get behind it and can find a provision for supporting it as a piece of national infrastructure.
Well, this is why I've come back to national infrastructure and National Archive, because I was Director of Science Q for a number of years. And there, even the herbarium, there's still a huge question mark over where it will go, because no research council wants to fund an archive, and least of all, there's no sort of business model that wants to fund these sorts of archives. So it really does need to work out actually what that means on the ground.
The Home Office have got plans to make a national archive for police, because they recognise how much money is being spent by police forces on these things. So the Home Office, I mean, ideally it wouldn't be a police archive.
That's why I was coming back to then, if you're going to put it in a national bank, it's identifying what does that actually mean in practical terms. But actually I ought to move on to my question, otherwise I'm going to we've moved on to the research and development priorities, and particularly Professor Daeid, I'd be really interested, because I think you made the point you said about the wish and need to strengthen the sector and attract new students, new people to do this, or maybe Professor Gallop, you made that point. You also made the point, which is where I think the problem is, that you need many, many disciplines to come into this. So do you see, are there master's programs, are there particular training schemes that ought to be set up in order to bring the next generation in, or is that not an issue to get the right students to follow through? Professor Daeid, maybe you can comment on that.
I think that you are putting your finger on the pulse. We have a very traditional model, I would say, of education in this country, right the way across the whole of the UK, where we have a set of undergraduate degrees that we deliver that have, if we put it in a forensic science context, that have forensic science in the name. Some of these degrees are excellent, some of them are not so excellent. Many of them will teach a little bit of science and then bolt on forensic applications, which means that in some cases, and not all, but in some cases, we produce graduates that don't know enough science to be perhaps useful within the forensic science domain. Other of the universities produce master's degrees in forensic science or in various specialties like forensic anthropology or archaeology or other sub-disciplines. And again, here they're bringing in graduates that have got an undergraduate degree in the relevant subject, and they're providing forensic application to that subject. Again, I think we're getting to the point where perhaps the output of some of those degrees are no longer fit for purpose, because forensic science and its use is changing as the world is changing. We need now graduates that are coming out of our universities that are able to code, that are able to do mathematics to a greater extent, that can do data curation, that are able to do science communication to a much greater and more profound way. So we need a different skill set coming into our laboratories than perhaps has traditionally been. It's always been, I taught forensic science at master's level for over 20 years, and it's always been the case that when we produce a graduate, and that graduate goes to work in a forensic science laboratory, one of the first things that happens is they're retrained in all of the skills that we thought we trained them in, how to do fingerprinting and chemical analysis or whatever it might be. So there's a disconnect between what's needed and what we as the academy is providing. And we're simply not listening, I think, and haven't listened for some time to our colleagues in practice. And what we may now be looking at is a landscape where continuous professional development, micro-credentials, CPD courses that are short and sharp for existing practitioners, but also upskill our graduates as they leave, may be a better way for looking at it. At the same time, forensic science graduates are provided with almost no training in law. So they do not know what they're walking into in terms of their roles and responsibilities to the criminal justice or civil justice systems, in the same way that our legal graduates know almost nothing about science. And so we've been trying to tackle that for some considerable time, but there is that disconnection, I think, that is now occurring more profoundly.
Mr. Gallop, what do you think the training should be for the best forensic scientists?
I think we should definitely do it differently. And I think there is a role for the National Forensic Science Institute here in making sure that we've got enough of the right sorts of forensic scientists for operational work. So not necessarily doing the training, but coordinating it, but using universities, using existing. I think Niamh is exactly right, to say let's be a bit more imaginative about that, both for scientists, but also for detectives and people who use forensic science. So we're all on the same page and we use it properly. So I think it's quite an exciting area, but it does need coordinating, and it needs the sort of the framework establishing. But we've got all the bits, and I think that's what we found when we were writing this report that we wrote, was that there's quite a lot of infrastructure which is there. It just needs knitting together in an imaginative way.
Do you think that UKRI has a role to play in this? I mean, I've noted, Professor Daeid, that your funding, a 10-year excellent funding, is from Leverhulme, not from UKRI, and I think that to me is also indicative of one of the. It doesn't come into any of these mainstream research councils, and I wonder whether or not that's another area where one should be exploring to say, well, where is the government putting funding in?
It is absolutely. The Leverhulme Trust had the foresight to fund back in 2016 disruptive research centres. We pitched in for one and we got that funding. It was competitive funding, both institutionally and once you got your bid out into the world. And we did that because there was no funding elsewhere. I think UKRI are making some effort, but they've produced a forensic science sandpit in 2023, which I attended, and I'm part of 2 consortia that received some of that funding. But I think we're a little bit letting them off the hook, if I can speak a little bluntly about it, because the funding for those 3 projects was about £2 million thereabouts, and that it's just simply not enough. I've received UKRI funding for other projects as well that have had obviously related to forensic science, and I've received funding from all sorts of other areas, including philanthropic funding. I think the challenge with the Forensic Science Sandpit in 2023 was a really good discussion, and it produced some really interesting outputs. Only one of the projects funded was in science, as in physical science. The other 2 are social science projects that border on criminology, which is fine and has its place, but it's not funding the core science. It's not funding projects to determine the persistence of fibers on materials or the persistence of DNA on materials. And that's what we need funded if we're going to interpret what finding those traces actually means in the real world. So I think there's a pile of work to be done with how we engage with UKRI and how we work with them to try to get the right level of investment into this domain.
Thank you.
I'd just make 2 quick points that, I mean, one of the reasons I'm here to give evidence today is because I'm actually on strike and I should be on a picket line with my colleagues today. And one of the reasons is because university departments are being closed, and it's not just arts and humanities. So our chemistry department is being closed, as have other chemistry departments. So your scientists of the future are getting fewer and fewer choices. And then graduates, we found the graduate salaries for forensic scientists in this country are just deplorable, and so they can't keep hold of the graduates. The churn is amazing because you've done your science degree, you're expecting a nice high salary in a STEM subject, and then you can't get that kind of salary in forensic science, so they can't retain the talent.
Yeah.
Lord Lucas, you want to come in?
I rather thought my question had been answered by Professor Nick Daeid, rather. So
I think it has. It has. Okay, well, I think we want to move on just to ask you a bit. You've been very patient and answering our many questions. We're drawing to a close, and we want to ask you a bit about what you think our responses should be, both in terms of your commission report and also our following up on our 2019 report. Baroness Young.
You gave us a lot of evidence about who's responsible in government terms or who's not responsible in government terms. I mean, since your report, or since our report, have you seen any signs of life in anybody taking an interest or responsibility?
Well, only like I explained earlier about the Home Office doing a big piece on police reform. And so forensic science is part of that, but we don't know how big a part. And again, like I say, it's only the police, and it's only the delivery, obviously, of operational forensic science. It doesn't consider any of the other crime scene court expertise and research and so forth. So,
and the announcement in November on the National Centre of Policing, is that?
Well, that's part of the plan.
Are there signs of life there yet?
Well, of course, that announcement was, we hope in some time in the future to have a National Centre for Policing. It's not happened. We don't actually know if it's happening.
And do we know what aspects of forensics it would take?
No, we just keep hear the word centralisation, nationalisation, but we don't know what that means. And so that's why I would recommend you speak to the Forensic Science Services Director, because it's her job to sort all that out, and she hopefully knows the answer to those questions.
We hope to have her as a witness. That's indeed. Professor Gallop, do you want to add anything?
I don't think so, particularly. I mean, there are lots of rumours circulating in the forensic community, but I don't think that's particularly helpful.
Baroness Neuberger.
So we know that you definitely want us to recommend and push for the National Institute. We've got that loud and clear. If you've got one, I mean, we've got to make this pretty sharp. We've obviously had lots of reports. Not a lot's been done. You've made that very clear. If there were one thing you really wanted, each of you really wanted us to say, what would it be? Professor Gallop, why don't you start?
I think just stop this drift of forensic science into the police and the prosecution, because it doesn't sit comfortably with the science and it doesn't sit comfortably with our adversarial criminal justice system.
I think one of the important things to do to stop that drift is proper investment, that somebody is responsible for this and they're going to invest their time as well as money into it.
It's the responsibility. Fine.
Responsibility.
Professor Nick Daeid.
I think, adding to what my colleagues have said, I think we need to think differently about the positioning of forensic science within the criminal justice system in the UK, in England and Wales specifically. But I think if you want one thing that you could ask for immediately, that is to put the development of research, and in particular the use of research data, into the frame of the creation of a national infrastructure for forensic science research, and frame it in that way, so that it begins to align with national infrastructures for other things. Yeah. It's a language people will understand.
And it ties together with the National Institute and so on, so you get a shape to the whole thing. Thank you very much indeed.
Baroness Warmothy, you wanted one final question?
Yes, thank you. It's been a very, very informative session, but there's two groups of people who have not been mentioned this morning. And you might think that a cross-party group of politicians might have those people in their minds, especially since we are reporting to the government, who is political by its very nature. And those two groups are victims of crime and people who are regarded as the accused. So can you say whether you think those two groups should appear in our report, and if so, in what context?
Well, we tried in our report to tie this into the government missions, because the missions for violence against women and girls, safer streets, road collision investigations, halving knife crime, economic growth. You can't have economic growth in a society where there's no law and order and crime is a problem. So all of these will benefit from investment in forensic science. So yeah, if you want to tackle violence against women and girls, forensic science is a key to doing that. And so it should be front and centre, but it's very peripheral at the moment. So plugging it into those missions that we already have.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree. Those are the two groups of people who are intimately affected by what goes on in
any one of us could fall into one or other of those categories at any time, and every single voter. Professor Nick Daeid?
I would agree entirely. In our research centre, we have a citizens' jury, which is made up of ordinary members of the public, against whom we speak to our research, and they tell us what they think, and they tell us very plainly sometimes what it is that they think of the area of travel. Other parts of Scotland have national assemblies. The Republic of Ireland has a citizens' assembly. These kind of citizens' voices are really, really important, particularly for the use of science in such an important space, so that we make sure that we get it right. But also that the victims, and also people who are accused falsely or wrongly, have got an opportunity to have their say in how we're going to use science within these most important areas of our society.
Well, thank you very much indeed, all three of you, for answering so many of our questions, and we're very grateful, especially Professor Nick Daeid, for your patience in being cut off more than once, but you've been excellent every time you've reappeared. Thank you, and thank all three of you. So this now concludes today's public